Okay, welcome back. In the last video, I challenged you to just tidy up your node tree, make sure it's really understandable and really readable for anyone that checks it out, and also for you as well if you return to it after a while. So all I'm really going to do here is I'm going to take this group here, which is already pretty tidy, and hopefully you've kept yours tidy as well. Use Ctrl J, and I'm just going to add in a label here, and I'm just going to call this ring creation, because this is essentially the part of the group that creates these rings. And I'll just lock this into place using Control. Now I think this part is fine. I don't think I really need to adjust this at all. So we'll just use Control and just tidy this up just a little bit. So that all seems to be working pretty nicely. Okay, so the next thing that I want to add into my material is the ability to add some knots. So knots occur on a piece of wood when there's a branch nearby where that plank has been cut essentially, and what you end up having is a bunch of kind of circles on your grain. And you can see that that's slightly different from what we have here, where we have a kind of almost a knot effect, but this is actually just where the different lines have been distorted and appear on the surface. The knots that we're going to create are just going to look a little bit different, and hopefully there should be enough controls built in that we can add them to our material if we want to just add a little bit of additional variation. So the way that I'm going to do this is pretty simple. I'm going to start creating it up here, and then we'll just add it back into our vectors down here somewhere. So I'm going to grab a mapping node. So we'll go to Vector, Mapping. We'll take our object mapping and we'll just plug it into the vector at the top here. And now what I want to do is grab a Voronoi texture. So we'll go to Texture, Voronoi. We'll plug in our vectors. We'll just zoom in a little bit so this is a little bit easier to see. We'll look at our distance, and you can see at the moment our distance gives us all these individual little cells, and we have a kind of dark dot in the middle, and then they get lighter as they get towards the edge of the cells, and depending on the size of the cell and their location, sometimes we don't get a black dot at all, and that's perfect for us because we don't want knots all over the entire surface. Next I want to go to 3D and change this to 4D. Still got our vector plugged in. Now we have this seed value that we can change. So if we have set up our knots and they look fine, but they're just slightly in the wrong place, we can just tweak a seed value and move that slightly. The next thing I want to do is grab a color ramp node, plug this in here, and I want to tweak these values, but I'm going to come back to that in a moment because I want to show you exactly why we're tweaking these values. So now that we have our color ramp, it's time to take this and plug it into our map. So at the moment we have this multiply node here. Now I think I'm just going to take this and plug it in. We're going to change this to add, and we're just going to add this color directly in here. So let's have a look at that result. And you can see what we get is we get all these little circles all over our object. Now obviously that's not what we want. We're going to use this color ramp node to fix that. Now the first thing I want to do is I actually want to flip this. So I'm going to flip that color ramp node. I'm going to take this black value and we're going to put it down until we only get a few of these dots on our surface. So essentially if we look through our color ramp, what you can see is we have black, which is a value of 0, remember. So we're not affecting our vector map with those values of 0. And anywhere where we have higher values, that's where we're going to start shifting our vectors. So if we go back to our end result, you can see as our value changes, we start to create an effect where we're getting almost these rings. So if we go back to our color ramp, in fact, let's undo that. This black value increases or decreases the number of knots we have. And then this white value, we can increase this up if we want, but that's not exactly what we want to do. What we want to do is just darken this value. And that's going to decrease the number of rings in our knots. And we really only want a couple of rings in our knots, to be honest. Now, the other thing that we have to do is we have to work with the scale of this. So I'm going to take the scale here and we'll just tweak this a little bit. So I'll take the scale down to something like 0.5, 0.6, maybe something around about there. We can take this value, we can increase this You can start to see some knots appearing there. We'll see if we can see some more. There's another one there that actually looks pretty good. But what we also want to do is we want to scale this just in the z-axis, because these knots tend not to be super round. So we can just scale this a little bit. Better look through the Voronoi texture. In fact, better look through the color ramp texture to see exactly what's going on here. We'll maybe tweak that scale a little bit. So just by scaling this a little bit on the z-axis, we can lengthen those out. Now at the moment, we are also getting a knot on the top, which is not very accurate. So what we would also like to do is just cut off those knots on the top, mask them off essentially. So this again is another thing that we've not done before. We're going to go to input. We'll go to geometry. And we're going to use normals. So you can see that when we use normal, we get different values on our sides. And what we can do is just use a separate XYZ. Well, I've actually chose a separate color, but actually does the same thing. And if we grab our value where we have white on the top, and then we just flip that, and we can do that pretty easy, just using an invert node. Then we can use a mixed color node. We'll plug this in here. We'll put this on the bottom, I think, and grab this, put it in the result, and put this one here. And now we can just change this to multiply. So if we have our factor all the way up, we essentially just mask off that top face. So that's a really good way of avoiding having any of those rings on the top. And we'll have a look at our result. So we should have our rings appearing on the side. You can see a few here and there. I'm not actually sure if that is one of the rings or not. Let's just test that to see. Just this value, and yeah, that is one of the rings, so that actually looks pretty decent. Now it would help if we also had a control for determining whether we have any of this effect or not. So let's just move these nodes out of the way a little bit. Let's duplicate this multiply node. We'll put it here. We'll take this second value and we'll make it black, and now we have a factor here that if we have it at 0, we have our knots. So if we have our factor all the way up, we don't have any knots, and we can even dial this in just to get a small effect of having those knots. So I'm just going to use invert, plug this in here, and now if I change this value to white, this factor is now going to be 0, and if we have 0, we have no knots. If we turn it all the way up, we have our knots. So that's going to be our knot control. That's just a very quick way of just inverting that number. Now again, last little thing that we want to do here is we want to just tidy up our node group a little bit, make that a little bit neater. And then we can just frame this up, Control J, F2, knots. Okay, so it's challenge time. Your challenge is to first of all finish tidying your node tree, make sure it's all framed and named. And then try and add one single node to give your material colour. Once you've added that node, hook it up to your principled BSDF node and adjust your roughness to get a nice shiny wood material just to see where we're at. So pause the video, have a go at that, and join me in a moment and I'll show you how I would do it. Okay, so I hope you got on well with that challenge there. There isn't really that much left to tidy up. We have our knot section here and we have our distortion here. Now at this point it might be worthwhile just framing these up and just calling this distortion. But I think just having two nodes there is pretty easy, pretty obvious to know what that does. And again, these nodes here, these are just working as utility nodes. Now the next thing we want to do is start working on colour. So let's just plug this value straight into our base colour and have a look. And we'll turn our roughness down a little bit. We are in cycles, we can start to see a little bit of a reflection there, but we don't have any colour. So we have a few options here for adding colour to our materials. You might want to try a colour ramp, and that gives you the advantage of grabbing a few different shades. Maybe just doing something like this. Maybe even adding another shade in the middle and tweaking that slightly so you can get something with a lot more variation. But I think it's just easier just doing a regular mix color node. So we'll add that into our factor and just grabbing a couple of different values here. So we'll go with a kind of desaturated light brown for one, and then we'll go with a slightly more saturated but darker brown for the other. And we have something like that. Now at this point we can really start to see our wood take shape. We still have a lot of things to add to it. We have a lot of micro details. We don't have any bump yet. We don't have any roughness variation. But at the moment I think that's actually starting to look pretty good. And I think if you're doing something stylized, this might even be the point where you would actually stop working on this particular node. But for us, we want to get a little bit more texture and a little bit more variation. So join me in the next video and we're going to start adding some more color variation. I'll see you then.